Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Very welcome on this very fantastic day. Welcome here at BAC for the Trainings for the Not Yet exhibition, which is an exhibition as a series of trainings and practices in how to be together otherwise. And we had a fantastic training this week with Carmen Papalia, thinking around what we need for accessibility. And we worked together, we thought together, and after this presentation we are also going to go out together to experiences, because I think a lot of our conversations were also around embodiment, experiences, sharing realities, sharing possible experiences, and committing ourselves to different realities for a more accessible future. And I'm very happy to give the mic to Carmen.
Thank you, Jana. I just have to say a huge thank you to Jana, to everybody at BAC, to Sana, to the folks involved in the trainings, our participants, folks involved with Activist Kitchen as well, and all our wonderful dinners each night. I felt very welcomed into this space, and I'm just so grateful. Spending time talking about accessibility is rare, and I think it's something that we need to do more of, but it's also something that I think really, it's a topic that impacts many aspects of our lives, whether we live with an experience of disability or not. So I just want to give a huge thank you to everybody, and thank you all for being here too. First, I'd like, so we've been opening up each session this week with a little exercise that I often do to get a sense of who's in the room. And I'd like to start with that exercise right now. So if I could just ask everyone to shut their eyes. And I'm closing my eyes too. And I'm gonna say my name, and then I just want someone else from the crowd to say their name, and then someone else to jump in and say their name until everyone has said their name once. And I'm going to start off the chain reaction, but I want everyone to keep their eyes shut until everyone said their name. So I'm just going to get comfortable in this space. Carmen.
Olga. Alban.
Thomas.
Amy. Vega. Sana. Anita.
Marcel.
Helen. Stefan. Anki.
Bobby.
Jelmer.
Lisa. Walter. Ada. Sandra.
Was that everybody? You can all open your eyes. Thank you. And we've been talking a lot about establishing a community of mutual care. This really grows out of a lot of my thinking about accessibility. My whole art practice is sort of based around different strategies for addressing my own access in various contexts. So, I write about accessibility. A lot of my performances are about accessibility. I showed this series this week that there's a piece in the show right now of me using a megaphone instead of my cane. So really thinking about reclaiming the social function of the cane, and instead of having it speak for me, speak for myself and use the words that I use to identify myself. I don't use the word blind or visually impaired because I think they still privileged the visual, and I've switched value or shifted value away from the visual to the non-visual. I think of myself as a non-visual artist. And so we've really been talking about the ways that we represent ourselves, the ways that we acknowledge our whole selves in a place, and find a community where we can do those things. Part of that series as well is me replacing my cane with all sorts of other things. In 2013, I did a performance where I replaced my cane with a marching band and a brass band that kind of I used to navigate a city in California, and they just were indicating different obstacles for me. So I really think of accessibility as a long-term, ongoing creative process, and many of these topics sort of, accessibility spoken about in this way really was sort of the basis of our meeting. Before we get on with maybe sharing a bit of reflections from our time together, I'd like to just share this manifesto that I wrote in 2015 called Open Access, and everybody should have a copy right now. So it includes 5 guiding principles, and at the time I just wrote this statement for myself as a way to identify what my own position on the topic of accessibility was. And it really identifies accessibility really differently than we typically do. Usually accessibility is determined through policy recommendations. It's through legislation that's through a compliance model. So if you don't offer these services to the public, there might be legal repercussions for non-compliance. I think about the kinds of relationship dynamics that something that is enforced from the top down creates between people who need care and people who are delivering care. So open access is really a framework for accessibility beyond a policy-based model. And I think of them as guidelines for mutual care. So I'd like to maybe just have 5 volunteers from the audience each read a tenet for open access. So it starts with open access relies on those present. So if there's someone that might be willing to read the first tenet.
Open access relies on those present, what their needs are and how they can find support with each other and in their communities. It is a perpetual negotiation of trust between those who practice support as a mutual exchange.
Open access is radically different than a policy that temporarily removes a barrier to participation for a group with definitive needs. It acknowledges that everyone carries a body of local knowledge and is an expert in their own right.
Open access is the root system of embodied learning. It cultivates trust among those involved and enables each member to self-identify and occupy a point of orientation that centers complex embodiment.
Open access disrupts the disabling conditions that limit one's agency and potential to thrive. It reimagines normalcy as a continuum of embodiments, identities, realities, and learning styles, and operates under the tenet that interdependence is central to a radical restructuring of power.
Open access is a temporary, collectively held space where participants can find comfort in disclosing their needs and preferences with one another. It is a responsive support network that adapts as needs and available resources change.
Thank you. So yeah, that just gives you a sense of like how we're defining accessibility, or how we're framing it at least. I define accessibility as a measure of agency. So it's really about one's decision-making power in a particular context. Like, do you have a freedom of movement within a space? Do you have the freedom to participate or define the terms around your own participation, around your own care? And so it's less about the physical infrastructure, and it's more about like, are you represented? Does the space consider you and your needs and the complexity of your needs, especially if they're changing and complex? Yeah, that's just like a little introduction. I'd like to maybe just open it up to a couple participants now, and just like to share like what their sense of, or maybe some of the things that they were some of the things that they like to share over our 5 days together. Do.
No.
So for me, it was a really engaging process that like I felt like I gained a lot from, and I heard some other people say it, that it felt very like intersectional, in a sense that the subject matters that we was discussing seemed to be about ideas of care that affected like all different people, and in many different ways. And so there was a lot of stuff that I think I would take from the training that could be applied both in sort of organizations that I'm connected to, or things that I work with. And I also found like Carmen's approach very empowering, and so in a sense that I feel excited to engage much more in these conversations and these actions around them, and even like my naive sort of perception of some of the ideas, like sorry, this idea of environments being disabling felt like something so simple, but that shift away from the individual and more to ways that we can help make a much better environments in many different ways. Not just physically, socially, and in ways that we can shift. That felt like a really big theme for me.
Thanks. Sandra, yes. Are you all right? Would you like to speak, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'd like to hold the microphone if I can, without ruining the suit. Going to maneuver. For me, it was a perspective-changing experience this past week. Specifically because I am dealing with complex needs. And this brings forth an interesting thing, because the concept of complex needs also involves the perspective. Like, complex to whom? For me, it's like the most basic need, but it's very complex as an organization or institution to facilitate, possibly. So this brings me to the fact that we had the language we used in our training was English, and because that's not my mother tongue, I was constantly reminded of what the Dutch words were. So for example, I've spent a lot of time in hospitals and in centers where you learn how to walk again after you've been in a wheelchair. But in Dutch, that's revalidation center. So that hit me this morning, that I've spent a lot of time in a center where I was revalidated upon being able to walk again. So that is really interesting that a personal experience can smack you in the face when you share with other people and have a big change of perspective. And I think that's the strength of this past week for me in sharing with all of the other participants. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for being so honest and vulnerable and generous. And I want to thank you as well, and Jeanne and Bach, because as far as the space is concerned, as far as the opportunities to either lay down or sit or rest, to be fed is an extraordinary experience of accessibility as far as I'm concerned. I want to give you one personal example. Part of my condition is that I faint, so I lose consciousness. But there was a dome here where we could lay down. So at one point when I was moving in and out of consciousness, I could still hear our group surrounded at the table discussing what was the practice of the afternoon. So I've never, ever experienced that kind of accessibility where I'm not literally in the room, but I'm still participating. Yeah. And I think this is a practice that we should continue. This should not be a one-off, an exhibition, a practice that is a unique event that we all got so privileged to participate in. But I think we should take with us that this is something that should be common practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think it goes to what we were talking about, like how do we pass these practices down? How do we like honor this space or hold this space in the same way when the people change or the same people aren't around the table? And I think what really connected for me yesterday was when we were discussing this idea of access intimacy. This is a term that comes from the trans disabled artist or activist Mia Mingus. And so access intimacy is sort of just this feeling that you get when you meet a person that understands your access needs, and there might not be need for conversation. There's just like this way that two people resonate across communities, across embodiments. And yeah, we just really, I think, have over this time in the space that we've held for these conversations built a sort of access intimacy with each other in the ways that people have been vulnerable to share, to disclose, and really just like to move through these very personal experiences and connect them to these larger topics. And yeah, so I really think that access intimacy really resonated with folks yesterday, and just learning about that topic. And I encourage you all to look this this article up by Mia Mingus, because I think it's pretty it's a component of care, or a dimension of care that that I think we miss when care is institutionalized or delivered through institutions, or just as the result of a policy recommendation. So. And after this discussion, we really were starting to think about what our subjective access needs were. So like I asked folks to answer this question: what do you need in order to thrive? And with regard to care, with regard to one's community, and we answered this question in a series of I want statements. So we were really thinking about subjective needs at the time, and. Yeah, so we developed our just a really long list of I want statements, and then used that as source material to develop these banners of slogans and statements, and just just ideas that we want to draw visibility to in a public setting. And we're going to use these as part of our procession after this chat. Yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of our time. I wonder if anyone has any questions, or any other participants might want to share anything about about the training. We could also have a question period afterwards, after the performance too. Mhm. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, that would be great. Oh yeah, yes. That sounds great.
So on Thursday, we basically ended the day with a whole list of I want statements. It was 2 or 3 A4s that we all had written in response to the question of what do we need to thrive. And then on Friday, we came together and the idea was like we have this whole list, and now how do we make banners or slogans out of this? And since the statements were quite varied, which what I did was I made well, actually, it started with something that Bobby said, like to make the I want statements into we want statements. So that's how I looked at all the statements that we had, and then because I always tend to want to organize things into like organized portions, I made. I saw that there were a lot of things that we wanted to be accepted. So I kind of made a sentence: "We want word to be accepted," and then I had a whole list of words. So that were all. I don't know the word of the type of words in English, but. And then this is the one that I picked all the verbs. So I started with "we want to," and then from the whole list I took all the verbs and collected them, and then together with Janneke we made this banner out of it. Does anyone else want to tell about their banners?
I just made one for Carmen. It was just a production for me. It was assigned, commission.
It's a slogan that I've been using. It's disabled by social disorder. Yeah.
Do you want to say something about yours? Do you want to maybe turn around and show it back? Is it possible? Do you,
At least one stick, one.
Hier, aan deze kant?
Let me see the handle, please. Yeah, that's the other one.
Ah.
So I imagined this as being voguing across the stage with this, but I'll just.
Do you want to say it loud?
No, you can just.
It says, let me say it right. I'm an advocate for radical slowness. On both sides, right?
Designed by Marcel, our group member. Yeah, I am an advocate of radical slowness. So I described a little bit that I faint, I pass out. And in passing out, there's a change in perception. So it feels like I'm moving into a slow motion. And I've always found this a fascinating and pretty valuable part of passing out, because you just have a totally different trip in compared to everybody else in the room. But because I spend a lot of time in bed or I walk very slowly, I've been thinking about pace. And in moving toward passing out, it's also like you have difficulty finding words or slower thinking or not being able to verbalize. So I have always thought there's a valuable quality in slowness, but most of you experience this as well probably, that we live in a fast-paced society, so it's not like automatic knowledge that there can be value in it. I think radical slowness is something that could offer a lot of people embodied knowledge that can be very beneficial. And during this past summer school at Bach, I had 2 interventions that were body-based and were also revolving around radical slowness. So yeah, I got some feedback of people who said they had a nap for the first time in 8 years, and were very much critical of the concept of radical slowness because they said it gave them a sense of not being taken seriously or being less urgent. And the person specifically that spoke to me about this is a political refugee, so he was very adamant about what you actually mean. So yeah, I think if we are open to a dialogue of exchange of embodied knowledges, that pace is a topic of discussion, and possibly even linear time, but that might be a little bit too radical. So some food for thought with this radical slowness. Let's make room for it.
So we're going to play a piece of audio. It's a statement that one of our participants, Whitney, produced, and this was in relation to thinking of like a collective statement for accessibility, and with regard to our group. And yeah, so this is Whitney's statement.
We, us here, now, many not present, can move toward accessibility. We can take time to learn and train to practice differently, in ways that take into account, that cherish, that embellish, that center myriad ways of communicating, learning, contributing, stepping out, relating, being present or not present, of asking, of telling, of respecting. We, us here, can acknowledge the things that bind and nourish, and work toward finding site-specific, time-sensitive ways of being together that do not perpetuate the stale structural methods and assumptions that harm so many, that harm the not majority, whatever majority is supposed to mean anyway. And we, us here, can build practices of continual reflection, discomfort, transformation, not healing, not comfort. Whose comfort? I am not comfortable. I am never comfortable. I do not heal. I will never heal. These wounds of histories are not comfortable, are likely never to heal to some completed whole of glossy function. We, here, us now, value, or we, here, us now, are trying to value. What is it? I don't know.
I think I'd like to leave our presentation there. I think those are really, that was a great way to conclude our presentation. If there are any questions now, we can take them, or we can go on to the performance and we can have questions afterwards as well. Okay. All right, well, I will be leading people on a eyes closed walk, where people will line up behind me and link arms and shut their eyes. I've mapped a route over the last few days for this walk. So anyone interested in walking with their eyes closed, I will just be meeting like right in the front entry, right outside the door, basically. And we also have some banners as well to walk with. So if you're interested in just walking with us, maybe you can help by holding a banner with a couple of folks. So yeah, thank you. And again, thanks for being here.